This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this critical thought, your daily discussion on game design. And be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright everybody, we got a great critical thought for you today. This topic was suggested by a fan and follower on Twitter regarding looking at the concept of dead games. And like I always say, if you have a suggestion for a future critical thought, be sure to leave it below. So, the topic of dead games is an interesting one, and it's becoming, I think, more and more prevalent, especially over the last few years with the changes to game design and to strategy of going forward. As we talked about in earlier critical thoughts, the use of games as a service has become a major element behind game development today. It's not just about making a game, selling it for 2 to 6 months, get as much profit as you can, and move on to the next one. It's about making games that are supposed to last, whether it is due to an extensive multiplayer system, to constant DLC, but basically developers and publishers want to get as much money out of a single title as possible. And what ends up happening is we're seeing games being released or games are being designed to go that distance. And what sometimes ends up happening is that they fail. And the idea of a dead game is a title that you literally cannot play the game in its original capacity or form. And this is usually due to multiplayer or online components that are no longer available. From the Twitter comment, he talked about examples of multiplayer and online games. Evolve over there, which if you can't tell is actually still shrink wrapped, has officially cut its support I think a few months ago, which will most likely mean that the game will either die or be left to a small group of the hardcore. And we can also talk about many of the smaller online competitive based titles. I'm not sure if Monday Night Combat and Super Monday Night Combat are still being developed or still being worked on as we speak. But the point of the games as a service is the fact that these games require constant updates. You need to keep seeing content coming out. It still needs to be supported. And when that support drops, it usually spells the end of the game. But we can actually talk about some things even past that. As we've seen over the last decade, there have been more attempts at bringing multiplayer or unique features and modes to games. An example that I remember would be the online, sort of like Total War-esque mode that was in Battle for Middle-earth 2. There's of course like the fantasy football options in, I think, like each yearly version of Madden. And there's of course the infamous example of the neighboring cities or sister cities, whatever it was, from SimCity 5. And with those three cases, these are all online features and modes that are developed for a game. Now, of course, with SimCity 5, there's the additional controversy of them requiring online features for a single-player title, or online functionality to play the game single-player. And what ends up happening is, when developers release these games, they're going by the assumption that these games will remain popular, and of course, they'll remain profitable. But when these games fail or sales begin to dry out, chances are one of the first things to go is to cut the server support, because that is I think it's like a monthly drain on the game or on the company. Now again, when we're talking about major companies like EA, Activision, 2K, stuff like that, they got quite a lot of money lying around. But we also have to think about the fact that this is for each and every one of their online games. And when it comes from a business perspective, you don't want to support something that is barely making you any money or is losing you money. But as I'm sure a lot of you are about to point out, what this usually ends up happening is screwing the consumer. And with games like Battle for Middle-earth 2, I can't play that mode anymore because the servers are down. And for any of the other like online competitive based titles, when they go cut off, there's no way to play these games anymore. And with each and every one of these titles, there's always going to be people who have supported these games from the start. They paid full retail, they may have bought any of the microtransactions, DLC, you name it. For instance, Age of Empires Online I think it lasted at least, I want to say 2 years, maybe three. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are people who plucked down the $20. They bought the premium civs, they bought all the other extra stuff, and when that game dies and you can't play anymore, that is literally wasted money because you will never see any more value of that. And speaking about games that have gone under, the other really big example of dead games would be the MMO genre. I think one of these days we may have to have just a critical thought talking solely about the MMO bus, but for today, as we all know, unless your game had World of Warcraft in the title, it was still a very risky proposition to make an MMO. The costs, the server maintenance, the continued support, and even just that initial development are all huge gambles for any developer and publisher to take on. And unless your game is bringing in enough to support all that, it can easily kill a studio. And we've seen what can happen with that with the many MMOs released over the thousands. Matrix Online, Car Assault, Sea of Heroes, which I actually did like and play. The original forms of Lord of the Rings, DC Universe Online, Final Fantasy 12. No, wait. I always get 12 and 13 confused. I should know this by now. I think 12 was the MMO? No, it was 13. I'm pretty sure it was 13. And again, we can just keep going down the list. And what happens is, for everyone who bought those games, subscribed for X amount of months, when those servers get pulled off, that's gone. Doesn't matter if you gave them $12 or $1,200 over a lifetime, you're never going to play those games again. And this also ties into the concept of what we talk about with game preservation. As you know, I am a huge proponent behind preserving games, making sure they can still be played. And whenever you have games tied to like an online service or a secondary feature or option, when those features get cut and there's no way to play these games, these games just cannot be played anymore. And this leads into a greater discussion about whether it's okay to use like pirated means or other options to play these games that are no longer being supported by the developers. For those of you watching, what do you think about that? Because that is a very tricky topic to work around. I've spoken to one of the representatives of the EFF, I think it was 2-3 years ago, regarding that very topic, and whether it is okay to use pirated or hacked means if it means to preserve a game and to keep it running beyond the lifespan of the developers. Now, when it comes to dead games, again, when it comes to single-player titles, games that can be played simply through the hard copy, we don't really have to worry about this too much. Again, there is the greater discussion about game preservation when it comes to the hardware, but that's definitely too big for today's talk. Now, with multiplayer and online games, again, this is one of those things it's very hard to talk more about simply because there's really hasn't been a set precedent for what to do here. Obviously, games like World of Warcraft, Guild Wars 2, and who knows how many other big-name titles, they're not going to be dropping support anytime soon. But for these smaller to mid-tier, either online multiplayer games or free-to-play slash social, that was not easy to get out, these titles always run that risk. And what happens is, what do we do when these games go out? Is there anything for the consumer to either keep or keep playing? Most often or not, there is nothing. Without having the online servers up in some capacity, you're not going to be able to access these games. In an earlier talk, when we talked about internet infrastructure, I mentioned third-party servers and what they can bring to the table in terms of allowing game to still be ran even if the official servers have been closed. But not every game is built around third-party servers. Sometimes we've seen cases where savvy consumers can use additional hardware or software to get around this. My example would be for the game Rise of Legends. When the GameSpy servers were terminated, there was literally no other way to play the online multiplayer. So a few friends found a way around this, I think, using a service called Hamachi, I think that's what it was called, to basically run unofficial third-party servers to play the game with. And while that is an option, whenever you have unofficial options, they're not really the best cases for game preservation. Because eventually, people will either forget about it or will no longer become available, and then you're back to square one again. It's the kind of talk we had with the discussion about leaving console or video game preservation to stuff like PSN, the Virtual Console, etc. While Nintendo and Sony are supporting that stuff, that's great. It's still being used and it can be ran. But what happens if they decide one day to pull it? And then what are we left with? And this is the same discussion with having these dead games. And it's not going to be an easy topic, and there's no quick solution for it. Because these games are built around these official servers and being maintained that way, if the developer doesn't want to or no longer can support the game, it basically leaves us SOL. And as another case in point, or a potential case in point, we have to talk about games like Evolve, and even stuff like Payday 2, and any other multiplayer-only specific titles. We brought this up with talking about multiplayer games earlier, but a multiplayer game is only as viable as its fan base. And in the earlier Critical Thought, we talked about why, in order for these games to succeed or stay relevant, you need both new players and your hardcore players in order to keep going. And what happens in these games is, if the developers decide to move on or can discontinue support or simply turn off their servers, these online games, which are still being bought and sold all around, will not be available anymore. If Overkill, for instance, or I'm sorry, I pointed at Evolve, but if Overkill announces tomorrow, for some strange reason, that they are discontinuing all support for Payday 2, that online community will die almost within a day, maybe a little bit more than that. And again, for the people who've been playing this game for the last, I guess we're going on 3 years now, it's, we got our money's worth. We certainly played the game a lot. But let's say someone brand new sees the game on Steam, decides to buy 4 copies for them and their friends. They load it up and find that they can't connect to any of the servers anymore, or the online infrastructure is just completely down. Then what are you going to do? You're kind of stuck. And we have seen cases where Steam has basically stepped in and say, you're not supporting your game anymore? Cut it from Steam. It's gone. We don't want it. And that is a very important management decision or position to take. That the game is no longer being supported and people are still trying to get money out of it. It can't be on a store like Steam. That's like going to a car dealership and finding cars there that are only half finished, or you buy a car and you find out later that there's no brake lines or whatever, that the manufacturer decided to stop working on that car line. And as we've certainly have seen with early access and games just not being able to get through development, that is certainly the case there. And I am very certain that there are more than a few examples of early access dead games. And that, my friends, is probably a topic in of itself, when a game simply just fails development. How it happens, why it happens, and what that means towards the consumer, especially when, again, we are talking about early access, and the fact that these people have already, who knows how many thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people who have supported this game to find that it's no longer being developed. And honestly, that is a really good critical thought, and if it wasn't for that, we're already getting close to 15 minutes in. We may want to talk about that today. But we'll say that for another time. I also have to get ready for tonight's episode of Game Wisdom Live. So to summarize today's critical thought, dead games are when you can literally not play the game anymore in its official capacity or its original form. And usually this refers to online-based games, multiplayer, competitive cooperative, and of course free-to-play and social. Some cases could be because the developers can no longer maintain it or they don't want to maintain it anymore. And for a lot of these games, you're kind of stuck. And as we talked about earlier, this does lead back into that talk about game preservation and making sure we can play these games in 5, 10, 15 years down the line. And if we don't set precedents and options today, that will come back to bite us tomorrow. And one last point to bring up. We are certainly going to be seeing, I think, more cases of this on the console side. Earlier, I mentioned the Madden series and how, with every year there's a new Madden game, they usually pull support on the previous year's one. But what about games that have online functionality built into them? As a really good point, I actually want to quickly look this up regarding the Monster Hunter Tri for the Wii, and if the servers are still up. And I actually, if the news is telling me, I think that they have been pulled. Let me just double check that. Yep, Monster Hunter servers were pulled as of the end of April 2013. Now, if you didn't play Monster Hunter Tri, I really liked that game. It was my first real exposure to Monster Hunter. And what that essentially means is if you can't play that game online, you lose access to all the online quests, online co-op mode, and basically everything that goes with that. So yes, you can still play the single player content, but it's essentially you're only having access to half a game. And like with something like Evolve, now that they're no longer doing support, I'm curious to see how long they're going to maintain those servers for. Now, of course, developers say we're going to keep them up for as long as we need to, as long as possible, but things can certainly change, as we have seen with so many MMOs that have been cancelled. I still miss City of Heroes, but again, that's another topic easily. So, with all that said, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you enjoyed things, be sure to like and subscribe, and suggest your own. Like I said, I'm going to be getting ready for Game Wisdom Live tonight, which, by the time you watch this, it should have already gone through. Be sure to check back I think we're going to try to keep it around like 7:30, 8 o'clock EST on Twitch on Thursday nights, but we'll see what happens. But once again, I'm Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check back tomorrow for more great content here and on Game Wisdom. Until then, see you all tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GW Bycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.